The scent of antiseptic and fear was a constant in the emergency room, a perfume Imani had learned to ignore.
Tonight, it was different.
It was sharp, metallic, the smell of blood and failure. The monitor screamed a single, relentless note, a flat line that cut through the controlled chaos. "Push another amp of AP," Dr. Evans shouted, his face slick with sweat under the harsh surgical lights. His voice, usually dripping with arrogance, was tight with panic. Imani's hands moved with an economy born of instinct and exhaustion. She drew up the epinephrine, her movements fluid and precise. But her eyes were on the patient's chart, then back to his pale, slack face. She saw it. The subtle rash blooming on his neck, the faint swelling of his lips. Anaphylaxis, not cardiac arrest. The AP was just fighting a ghost. "Doctor," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through his next command. "It's not his heart. It's an allergic reaction. Look at his neck. We need to administer a different protocol." Evans glanced down, his eyes barely registering what she was pointing at before dismissing it. "He has a known heart condition, nurse. Do as you're told." The monitor didn't lie. They were losing him. Imani made a choice. It was the kind of choice that ended careers, but the other option ended a life. As Evans turned to yell at another resident, she grabbed the correct vial from the crash cart, loaded a new syringe, and injected it directly into the patient's thigh. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The flatline held. Evans whirled on her, his face a mask of fury. "What did you do? I'll have your license for this." Then a beat. A single, beautiful spike on the monitor. Then another. A ragged, fragile rhythm returned. The patient's airway, which had been closing, eased open with a shuddering gasp. Color began to seep back into his skin. The room breathed out. A resident patted Imani's shoulder in silent gratitude. But Dr. Evans stared at her, his brief relief swallowed by a wave of pure, unadulterated rage. He had been wrong, and she had shown him up in front of his entire team. An hour later, she was in his office. He didn't ask her to sit. "You are insubordinate," he said, not looking at her, focused on straightening a stack of papers that were already perfectly aligned. "You directly disobeyed a superior's order in a critical situation. It's reckless. It's dangerous." "I saved his life," Imani said. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the trembling in her hands. "You got lucky," he snapped, finally meeting her eyes. His were small and cold. "This hospital cannot tolerate nurses who think they know better than the doctors.
Pack your things.
You're terminated." There was no appeal. No hearing. Just the cold, final slam of a door. She walked to the locker room in a daze, the cheerful blue of her scrubs suddenly feeling like a costume she was no longer entitled to wear. She methodically emptied her locker into a brown cardboard box, a well-worn pair of sneakers, a dog-eared medical textbook, a framed photo of her and her older sister laughing on a beach. Each item felt like a piece of a life that had just been declared over. Carrying the box, she began the long walk of shame out of the hospital. She kept her chin up, her gaze fixed on the glass doors at the far end of the lobby. She would not let them see her break. The waiting room was a sea of anonymous suffering, people absorbed in their own fear and boredom. No one noticed the nurse with the box, just another piece of hospital furniture being moved. Then the atmosphere shifted. A collective intake of breath. The low hum of conversation died, replaced by a sudden, heavy silence. Outside the main entrance, a trio of gleaming black sedans had pulled up to the curb, silent and menacing as sharks. The doors opened in unison, and men in dark, impeccably tailored suits emerged. They moved with a purpose that was both unnerving and magnetic. The glass doors slid open, and he walked in. He was the center of their gravity, the reason for their formation. He moved like the room owed him space, and the air seemed to thin around him. His suit was a deep charcoal, custom-made, fitting a frame that was lean but powerful. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but he was the most absolute. As he passed under a light, Imani saw the collar of his white shirt was unbuttoned just enough to reveal the edge of something intricate and blue-black inked into his skin. A dragon scale, maybe, or a wave. His face was carved from stone, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines. His eyes, dark and intelligent, swept the room once, dismissing every person, every piece of furniture, every flicker of movement as irrelevant. Then they landed on her.
On Imani.
Standing there in her pale blue scrubs, holding the pathetic box of her dismantled career. He did not look away. He started walking towards her, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor. His men fanned out, creating a perimeter of silent intimidation that kept the rest of a hospital lobby frozen in place. Imani's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought she had done something wrong, parked in the wrong spot, witnessed something she shouldn't have. But his expression held no anger. It held nothing. It was a perfect, unreadable mask. He stopped a few feet in front of her. He was taller than she'd first thought. He smelled of cedar and cold night air. He looked at her box, then back at her face. His gaze was so intense it felt physical, like a pressure against her skin. Then he did something that shattered the world. He inclined his head, and then folded at the waist into a deep, formal bow. It was not a casual nod. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect.
A salute.
From the corner of the lobby, Dr. Evans appeared, drawn by the commotion. He saw the scene, the fired nurse and the formidable man bowing to her, and a look of utter bewilderment crossed his face. The man straightened, his eyes still locked on Imani's. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and resonant, a gravelly timbre that seemed to vibrate in the silent room. "Your service is honored," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a decree. Behind him, his men were now carefully lifting a gurney from one of the cars. On it lay an elderly man, pale and frail, hooked to a portable monitor. It was clear who they were here for. But their leader's first, most important act had been to find her, to acknowledge her. Kaito, though she did not know his name yet, turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon the stunned Dr. Evans. The shift was subtle, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "She will be attending him," he stated, his voice devoid of any room for argument. "No one else." Evans finally found his voice, sputtering with a mix of fear and indignation. I'm sorry, sir, but this nurse, she's no longer an employee here. She was just terminated." Kaito's eyes narrowed. The look he gave the doctor was one of pure, distilled ice. It was the kind of look that ended bloodlines. "That," he said, "the word clipped and lethal, is a temporary problem you will now fix. Reinstate her. Immediately." Imani stood frozen, the cardboard box suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her arms. She had no idea who this man was, or why he had singled her out. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life had just been irrevocably broken in two. This was the before, and everything that came next would be the after. The next hour was a blur of surreal efficiency. Dr. Evans, pale and trembling, practically tripped over himself to process her reinstatement paperwork. The hospital administrator, a man who had never once acknowledged Imani's existence, personally escorted her to a private wing she hadn't known existed. It was less a part of the hospital and more a luxury hotel suite with medical equipment. Kaito's men stood guard outside the door, silent sentinels in their dark suits. They had effectively annexed a section of the hospital. Inside, the elderly man from the gurney, Mr. Tanaka, lay in a state-of-the-art bed. Kaito stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, his back to her. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and expectant. "His chart," Kaito said without turning around. A tablet lay on the bedside table. Imani picked it up. She was a nurse. This was her job. She focused on the familiar rhythm of the work, checking vitals, reading notes, assessing the patient. It was an anchor in the swirling madness of the last hour. Mr. Tanaka was old, his body failing under the weight of a long illness. Her job was to make him comfortable. Palliative care. She worked for hours, Kaido a constant, unmoving presence in her periphery. He never spoke, never interfered. He just watched. She could feel his gaze on her as she adjusted Mr. Tanaka's pillows, as she checked his foredrip, as her hands moved with practiced gentleness. He wasn't watching her like a hawk, waiting for a mistake. He was watching her like an art critic studying a masterpiece, with an unnerving, analytical focus.
She was a puzzle he was trying to solve.
Late into the night, Mr. Tanaka began to stir. His eyes, clouded with age and pain, fluttered open. He looked past Imani, towards the figure at the window. "Akemi," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He reached a trembling hand out. "You came back. Kaido, you promised." Kaido moved from the window then, crossing the room in 2 silent strides. The mask of indifference he wore had fractured. For a single, unguarded moment, Imani saw a flash of raw, profound pain in his eyes. It was a deep, old wound, one he had carried for a very long time. He gently took the old man's hand. "I am here, sensei," Kaido said, his voice softer than she'd heard it. "Rest now." The name, Akemi, hung in the air. Mr. Tanaka drifted back to sleep, but the ghost of that name remained. Later, as Imani was replacing a bag of saline, she found the courage to speak. "Who was Akemi?" she asked quietly. Kaido was back at the window, the city his silent confidant. He didn't answer for a long time. She thought he was going to ignore her. "She was someone I failed to protect," he said finally, his voice flat. It was not an explanation. It was a confession and a wall, built in the same breath. The danger came not with a bang, but with a quiet knock. A man in a doctor's coat, not one Imani recognized, appeared at the door. Kaido's guards, conditioned to respect hospital authority, let him pass after a brief check of his ID. But something was wrong. His coat was too new, too crisp. He avoided Imani's eyes. He moved towards Mr. Tanaka with a syringe in his hand, filled with a clear liquid. "A vitamin supplement ordered by his primary physician," the man said, his voice a little too smooth. Imani stepped between him and the bed. "His primary is Dr. Lee. I spoke with him an hour ago. He ordered no new medications." "Who are you?" The man's smile tightened. He tried to brush past her. "Nurse, please." Before he could take another step, Kaido was there. He moved with a speed that was preternatural, a blur of dark wool and lethal intent. He didn't grab the fake doctor. He simply placed a hand on the man's wrist, the one holding the syringe. The man froze, his eyes widening in terror. Imani heard a faint, sickening crack. The syringe fell from nerveless fingers and clattered on the floor. Kaido said nothing. He simply steered the man, now whimpering in pain, out of the room and into the hallway. The door clicked shut. Imani didn't hear a struggle. She heard only a single, muffled thud. A few moments later, Kaido returned alone, adjusting the cuff of his shirt. There was not a speck of dust on him. He looked at Imani, his dark eyes holding a new light.
It was respect.
"The hospital is no longer secure," he said. "We are moving him." An hour later, they were preparing to leave. Kaido approached her as she packed a medical bag. He placed a thick envelope on the table beside her. It was filled with cash. More money than she had ever seen in her life. "Your service is complete," he said, his tone formal again. "You were exemplary.
Take this.
You can leave. No one from my world will trouble you." He was giving her an out, a clean break. She could take the money, disappear, and pretend the last 24 hours had been a fever dream. She could go back to being no one, safe and anonymous. She looked at the money, a solution to every practical problem she had. Then she looked at the sleeping face of Mr. Tanaka, so vulnerable. And finally, she looked at Kaido. She saw the loneliness in his posture, the immense weight of the empire he carried on his shoulders. She saw the ghost of Akemi in his eyes. He was offering her an escape, but he was also testing her. Imani pushed the envelope back across the table towards him. "He still needs a nurse," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not leaving him until he's stable. Or until it's over." It was a deliberate choice. The moment she stepped out of her old life and into his, a flicker of something, surprise? Admiration? Crossed his face before the mask was back in place. They rode to the safe house in the back of an armored sedan. The city streaked by in a blur of neon and shadow. Mr. Tanaka lay on a modified bench seat, stable and sleeping. The space was close, intimate. Imani was acutely aware of Kaido beside her, the solid presence of his thigh just an inch from her own. The silence was thick with everything they weren't saying. Their knees brushed as the car took a sharp turn. A jolt, like an electric current, shot through her. Neither of them moved away. The contact was a tiny point of heat in the cool, dark car. He turned his head, his face half in shadow. His eyes found hers and held them. "You are a foolish woman, Imani," he said. He said her name for the first time. It sounded different in his mouth. Not just a name, but a statement. The way he said it felt like a claim. And his tone wasn't an insult. It was laced with a strange, reluctant wonder. The safe house was a penthouse that seemed to float above the city, a fortress of glass and steel. It was minimalist and stark, decorated in shades of black, gray, and white. It felt less like a home and more like the private lair of a very elegant predator. This was his space, his world, and she was in the dead center of it. For days, a tense routine settled in. Imani cared for Mr. Tanaka, whose condition remained fragile. Kaido was a constant shadow, sometimes in the room, sometimes just outside it. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew heavier, more charged. She found herself watching him when he didn't know it. The way his long fingers rested on a book he wasn't reading, the tension in his jaw as he took a phone call, the brief moments his guard dropped when he looked at his sleeping mentor. One afternoon, needing sterile gauze, she went looking for a supply closet. She opened a door she thought led to a storage area. It was his office. The room was as Spartan as the rest of the penthouse, dominated by a large black desk. And on that desk, laid out in a neat grid, were photographs. Of her. There were dozens of them. Imani walking to her car after a shift. Imani sitting on a park bench, eating a sandwich. Imani at the grocery store, frowning at a carton of milk. They were surveillance photos, taken over weeks. A cold dread washed over her. He hadn't just happened upon her in the hospital. Their meeting wasn't a coincidence. It was an acquisition. She stood there, heart pounding, when he walked in. He saw her, saw the photos, and his face gave nothing away. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "You were watching me." "Yes," he said, without apology. He walked to the desk, not bothering to cover the evidence. Mr. Tanaka's health was failing. His circle had been compromised. We needed an outside professional. Someone with skill, but more importantly, someone with integrity. My people vetted 37 nurses in this city. They looked for financial trouble, for vices, for any weakness that could be exploited. He picked up a photo of her laughing with her sister. "They found none in you. You were clean. Incorruptible. You were the one who couldn't be bought." He had chosen her, researched her, targeted her. The thought was both terrifying and strangely flattering. "The salute in the hospital," she whispered. "It was a public declaration," he said, his eyes intense. "A message to my rivals. It placed you under my protection. It made you untouchable." He stepped closer, invading her space, the scent of cedar and smoke surrounding her. "I calculated every variable, every possibility. I did not, however, anticipate this." The word hung between them. This. The suffocating tension. The awareness that had grown into a dangerous, unspoken attraction. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. The enemy he spoke of was not content to be thwarted. A rival Yakuza faction, led by a man named Ruji, saw Mr. Tanaka's illness and Kaido's strange preoccupation with a foreign nurse as a weakness to be exploited. They couldn't breach the penthouse, so they attacked her past. Her phone rang one evening. It was a restricted number. When she answered, the voice on the other end made her blood run cold. It was Dr. Evans. He sounded terrified. They have me, he rasped. These men, they said you'd understand. They want you to come to the old clinic on the waterfront. Alone. If you don't, they'll kill me. She knew it was a trap. Her mind screamed it. But her conscience, the part of her that had become a nurse to help people, twisted in knots. Even a man as odious as Evans didn't deserve to die. She told Kaito. His face became a mask of cold fury. You will not go. It is a trap meant for you. I can't just let him die, she argued, the first real fight they'd ever had erupting between them. You are not a nurse anymore, Imani. You are in my world now, he countered, his voice dangerously low. Your compassion is a liability they will use to kill you. He was right, and she hated him for it. She felt like a prisoner, her own morality turned into the bars of her cage. But Ruji's plan was more insidious than a simple kidnapping. When she refused to take the bait, he escalated. A story broke online, then in the tabloids. A disgraced nurse, fired for malpractice, now the live-in mistress of a known Yakuza boss. They used a grainy photo of her and Kaito entering the sedan. They twisted her termination into something sordid. They destroyed her name, her reputation, her entire professional life. They salted the earth of her past, so she would have nowhere to run back to. She was truly trapped now. The world she knew was gone, burned to the ground by men she'd never met. All she had left was this penthouse, this dying old man, and the lethal, complicated man who had brought this storm down upon her. The attack came at dusk, when the city was a tapestry of glittering lights. It was not subtle. It was a declaration of war. An explosion rocked the floor below, a concussive blast that shattered the panoramic windows. Alarms blared. Kaito's men, stationed throughout the building, were engaged in a brutal firefight. Ruji was making his final, desperate play. Kaito moved instantly, his calm transforming into a focused, deadly grace. Stay with him, he ordered, his voice ablaze in the chaos as he pressed a small, cold pistol into her hand. Use it if you have to. He was gone before she could protest, a dark shape disappearing into the smoke-filled hallway to defend the choke point leading to Mr. Tanaka's room. Imani's hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. The sounds of gunfire were getting closer. The secure room was no longer secure. She barricaded the door with a heavy table and stood over Mr. Tanaka, who slept on oblivious. Then a new sound. The groan of metal from the balcony. One of Ruji's men, a mountain of a man with a cruel smile, was rappelling down from the roof. He shattered the glass of the balcony door and stepped inside. He saw her, saw the gun in her hand, and laughed. He advanced on her, confident she was just a terrified civilian. He was wrong. She wasn't a killer, but she was a nurse.
She knew the human body.
And she had been living in Kaito's world long enough to learn its first rule: survive. She didn't fire the gun. Her hands were too unsteady. Instead, she grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a solid crystal vase from a side table. As the man lunged for her, she didn't cower. She moved, using his momentum against him. She brought the vase down in a hard, desperate arc, not on his head, but on the precise point of his collarbone, a spot she knew from her anatomy studies was uniquely vulnerable to fracture. He roared in pain and surprise, his arm going limp. The momentary advantage was all she needed. She scrambled for the medical cart, grabbing a canister of ethyl chloride, a vapor-coolant spray used to numb skin. She discharged the entire can into his face. It wouldn't stop him for long, but the intense, freezing cold and chemical vapor sent him staggering back, disoriented and temporarily blinded. It was in that moment that the door to the room burst inward. Not Kaito's men. It was Ruji himself, flanked by two more of his soldiers. He saw his incapacitated man, then looked at Imani with a new, dangerous respect. The nurse's claws, he said with a smirk. Kaito always did have a taste for the exotic. He raised his own weapon. This was it. There was nowhere to run. But before he could fire, a blur of motion came from the hallway. Kaito. He had dealt with the others. He moved like a phantom, a whirlwind of precise, brutal violence. He dispatched Ruji's men in a flurry of motion that was too fast to follow.
Now it was just the two of them.
The two clan leaders. Ryuji, enraged, turned his gun on Kaido. But Kaido was faster. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Ryuji crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror over. Silence descended, broken only by the distant sounds of sirens. The battle was over. The penthouse was a ruin of shattered glass and scarred walls. Kaido stood breathing heavily, a cup bleeding freely from his temple. He ignored it. His eyes were only for her. He walked to her, his gaze taking in the scene, the groaning man on the floor, the empty canister in her hand, the fierce, terrified defiance in her eyes. He reached out and gently took the empty vase from her trembling fingers, setting it aside. His thumb came up to trace the line of her jaw, his touch surprisingly soft. "Akemi was my sister," he said, his voice raw, finally giving her the whole truth. "I brought her into my world, and my enemies saw her as a weakness. He used her to get to me. She died because I failed to protect her. I swore I would never allow anyone to get that close again." He looked at her and the mask was gone. All that was left was the man, wounded and weary. "Ryuji saw you as my weakness." He was wrong, his voice dropped to a near whisper. "You are my strength." In the quiet aftermath, as Kaido's organization cleansed the evidence of the battle, Mr. Tanaka passed away. It was peaceful, a gentle fading. The cost of their victory was the loss of the man who had been a father to Kaido. And the cost for Imani was the loss of the woman she used to be. Her old life was ash. A week later, the penthouse was pristine again, the scars of the battle erased as if they had never been. The city glittered below, a silent, beautiful witness. Kaido found her on the balcony, watching the endless flow of traffic. He held out a thick manila envelope. "Your name is clear," he said. Dr. Evans was persuaded to recant his statement and resign. "But the story will always follow you. This," he nodded to the envelope, "is a way out. A new identity, a passport, an account with enough money to start over anywhere in the world you choose. It is the freedom I took from you." It was his greatest gesture of respect. A choice. He was letting her go, even if it cost him everything. She looked at the envelope, the tangible proof of an escape she once would have desperately craved. She thought of a quiet, simple life in some unknown city. Safe, sterile, empty. Then she looked at him, at this dangerous, complicated man who saw her, truly saw her, when the world had dismissed her. He had shown her respect when she was at her lowest, and he had come to depend on her in a way he depended on no one else.
She didn't take the envelope.
Instead, she slid her hand into his. His fingers, calloused and strong, hesitated for a fraction of a second before curling around hers, holding on tight. It was an answer given without a single word, a choice made in the quiet space between two heartbeats. She was not leaving. This violent, beautiful, dangerous world was her world now. He was her anchor, and he had come to realize, was his. Together, they turned back to the view, two solitary figures no longer alone, watching the dawn break over their new, uncertain empire.